All right, hello and welcome to this training. As you can see from the title, what we're going to be covering is boredom tolerance is the cheat code to success. And as you can see from the overview, what we're going to be talking about more specifically is first, boredom as the real bottleneck, why monotony breaks most people, training boredom tolerance, making boredom work for you, the review, and your action items for the day or the next few days. Now, before we get started, if you like this type of content, make sure to subscribe, like the video, comment below what you'd like to see next. And with that said, let's get started and talk about boredom as the real bottleneck. So here's the thing most people get wrong about why they're stuck. They usually assume the problem is some kind of a motivation problem or discipline problem or some kind of a character flaw, when really the issue is way more boring than that. The actual bottleneck, the thing quietly killing most goals, is an inability to tolerate mundane, repetitive, unsexy work for long enough to actually see results. And that sounds almost too simple to be true, which is probably why nobody really talks about it. And this bottleneck is one of those things that just sits there, doing its damage in the background while you blame other stuff. You'll think the problem is your strategy or your niche or your offer, when actually you just got bored and wandered off before anything had a chance to work. Now, boredom creeps in slowly, and by the time you actually notice it, you've already pivoted to something better. And the worst part is you'll genuinely believe you quit for a good reason, and you'll have a whole story about why it made sense to stop, and boredom won't be in that story anywhere. Now, results from consistent action usually lag behind the effort by weeks or sometimes months, which means that you often quit right before things would have clicked. Sometimes they lag by years. And so everyone's out here optimizing their morning routines and their productivity apps. Meanwhile, the real issue is that they can't sit with a task for 45 minutes without actually reaching for their phone. And all the fancy systems in the world won't really help you if you stop every time the work gets a bit repetitive or boring. Now, most productivity advice treats symptoms: time blocking, habit stacking, accountability partners, increasing your focus. None of it actually addresses one of the core issues, which is that you fundamentally can't handle boredom or monotony. And the fix isn't another app or another framework. The fix is training your nervous system to actually stay put when nothing exciting is really happening. So what even is boredom tolerance? It's your ability to keep doing the thing when the emotional payoff kind of has disappeared, when feedback is non-existent, when the task itself feels flat and kind of pointless in the moment. And it's about staying engaged while your brain is screaming for something or anything more stimulating. And that's it. That's the whole skill. This shows up most clearly in execution, when the planning is already done and you're just really doing the work. The vision is clear, the steps are obvious, and yet something in you keeps wanting to just check something else or revisit the plan or start a new project. Now, the work itself often isn't even hard. Writing an email, making a call, editing a video, following up with a lead, none of it is intellectually really demanding. It's just boring. It's just monotonous. And so the boring stuff usually needs to happen over and over. And that same task, that same motion, that same energy, day after day. And that's where people really tap out, is because it's the boring stuff that actually give us the results, but the boring stuff need to happen over and over again, and yet they're boring. And so there's no dopamine hit waiting for you there. There's no likes, no comments, there's no pats on the back. You're just alone with the task, and your brain basically hates that. And it wants stimulation, and when it doesn't get any, it really starts looking for exits. And the feeling isn't really pain exactly. It's more like nothing. And nothing is surprisingly hard to tolerate when you're used to constant input and constant stimulation. Your body might feel fine, but your mind starts pacing and you get this itch to do something else, anything else, even if logically you know the task in front of you matters more. And let's also be clear about what boredom tolerance isn't, right? Because people confuse it with grinding or just keep on working, essentially. It's not forcing yourself through some kind of misery. It's not forcing yourself to suffer for the sake of suffering. It's not hating every minute of your day and calling it discipline. Real boredom tolerance is calm. You're not clenching your jaw and pushing through. You're just present with the task you're doing, even when it feels kind of boring. And there's a steadiness to it that actually feels lighter over time, not heavier. So the goal isn't tension. The goal isn't for you to keep pushing, essentially. This is not what we're talking about here. The goal is neutrality. You're not excited. You're not miserable. You're just there doing the thing, essentially. And your nervous system learns to be okay with that low stimulation environment. That's the adaptation we're actually training for. And burnout comes from chronic stress and overwork, not from tolerating boredom. If you think about it, these are different problems with different causes. You can absolutely burn out while constantly seeking stimulation, because stimulation seeking is exhausting in its own way. So boredom tolerance is about regulating your response to monotony. Burnout is about running your system into the ground. I'm not saying just work hard even if you find it unfulfilling. Don't conflate them. Those are two different things. In fact, building boredom tolerance can actually protect you from burnout because you stop constantly chasing intensity and learn to work at a sustainable pace. Now, the most important part of all of this is that boredom tolerance is a trainable skill. You weren't born with a fixed amount of it. You can actually build it. Same as you'd build strength or endurance. Same as you would increase your running capacity. Your brain can literally adapt to handle low stimulation environments better over time. And neuroscience actually backs this up. The brain rewires itself based on repeated experience. So if you keep exposing yourself to boring tasks without escaping, your threshold for tolerating them basically goes up. So every time you sit with boredom instead of running from it, you're sending a signal to your nervous system that this is actually survivable. And you don't have to basically start with marathon sessions of focus where you try to focus for 4 hours straight or something like that. Even small doses of uninterrupted, unstimulated work start shifting the baseline. And this means that it doesn't matter how distractible you are right now. It doesn't matter how many times you've really failed to stick with things. That's just your current tolerance level. And current doesn't mean permanent, right? You're not just someone who gets bored easily. You're someone who hasn't trained this capacity yet. It's a big difference. So once you realize that it's actually trainable, you stop feeling like a victim of your attention span, and you can start treating it like a project, a self-improvement project in a way, just like any other skill. And this skill doesn't get talked about because it's not really attractive. Nobody's selling a course on how to sit still and just do boring work. There's no viral hook and just keep going when it's boring. But that's exactly why it's such an edge, because almost nobody's actually working on it. The people who win consistently almost always have this capacity. Just look around. They just don't name it. They'll talk about discipline or grit, but underneath all, that is just basically an unusually high tolerance for monotony. And it's just a quiet advantage that no one sees, and no one sees you building it either. No one congratulates you for it, but it keeps compounding in the background. And in a world where everyone's dopamine fried and jumping between tabs, the person who can actually stay locked in for 90 minutes without distraction is already the top tier, right? Think about how much output comes from just sustained attention and effort over time. 1 hour of deep, uninterrupted work often beats 4 hours of low focus work. Boredom tolerance is basically a multiplier on everything else you do, and the gains aren't linear. Small improvements in your ability to actually stay focused lead to disproportionately large improvements in results. And it stacks with everything else, your strategy, your skills, your network. All of it works better when you can actually keep taking action long enough for things to take effect. And without the skill, everything else you build will kind of sit on shaky ground. You can have the best plan, you can have the clearest goals, the most refined system, and still sabotage yourself the moment things stop feeling exciting. Boredom tolerance is the floor beneath all of your other ambitions. And it's like trying to build a house on sand. The structure might look good, but it won't hold. Boredom tolerance is the concrete foundation that you pour before anything else goes up. And once it's in place, everything you build on top of it becomes more stable. Your habits stick, your projects finish, you progress faster in general, and you stop being someone who has great ideas but never follows through, and you become someone who actually delivers consistently even when no one's actually watching. And honestly, most other productivity advice actually assumes that you already have this capacity. That's why so many people actually struggle with all the other productivity advice, is because all that productivity advice actually assumes you have boredom tolerance. It assumes that you can actually sit on a task for 45 minutes, 2 hours, etc. That's why it fails for so many people. They're trying to optimize a process that they can't even sustain. And you have to build boredom tolerance first, before the time blocking, before the habit stacking, before the fancy workflows. And this skill actually unlocks everything else. It's the bottleneck. And once you clear it, a lot of other things start working automatically. So you probably already know what you need to do to actually hit your goals, and the steps aren't really a mystery. So the issue is you keep getting bored and wandering off before the steps have actually any time to work. And that's the honest truth for most people. You've read the books, you've watched the videos, you're watching videos like this, maybe even built the system, and still here you are looking for something new because the last thing stopped feeling exciting. And that's probably sounds very familiar right now, but this is a pattern that most people are in. And it's not necessarily a one-time thing. It's probably happened with fitness, with business, with content, with relationships even, and romantic relationships as well. And the domain changes, but the underlying issue always stays the same. And it will keep recurring until you address the root cause, because no amount of strategy will really save you from a nervous system that hasn't been trained to sit still and actually focus on something. So it might be a bit uncomfortable to hear, but if you can accept that boredom tolerance is your actual bottleneck, you can finally start working on the real problem instead of the symptoms. And there's something weirdly freeing about this realization. You don't need a new strategy. You don't need more information, at least a lot of the times. You just need to build the capacity to really stick with what you already know works. That's it. And that's very actionable. It's a concrete skill you can actually train starting today. If you already know the actions you need to do, then just sitting with them for a longer period of time is what you need to do. So the path forward from here is actually pretty simple. Once you see the problem clearly, if boredom is the bottleneck, then training boredom tolerance is the leverage point, right? Everything else is downstream of that. Everything else gets easier once this piece is in place. And there's no trick here, no hack, no shortcut. You literally just have to practice being bored without escaping. You literally have to practice sitting in the same spot, doing the thing for a long period of time. That's the whole method. And the next sections will actually, of course, break down exactly how to do it in a way that actually sticks with you. But fair warning, the approach is going to sound boring because it is, because that's the exact point. Simple doesn't mean easy, and boring doesn't mean ineffective. Often the opposite is really true. Now, we've named the real bottleneck so we can actually look why it trips people up so hard, because understanding the mechanics of monotony, of how monotony breaks people, is the first step to actually making sure it doesn't break you, right? That's what we'll dig into next. And there's a predictable pattern to how people lose momentum. And once you see it, you can basically interrupt it before it actually takes you out. So knowing how failure shows up in advance gives you a fighting chance, and you'll recognize what's actually happening in real time instead of only seeing it in hindsight. So with that said, let's discuss why monotony breaks most people. So there's a predictable cycle that actually plays out almost every time someone starts something new. And once you see it, you basically recognize it everywhere. It happens with fitness, goals, with business projects, with content creation, with skill building, basically any area where sustained effort is actually required over a longer period of time. And the pattern is so consistent, it's almost eerie. And yet most people go through it over and over again without actually ever naming what's really happening behind all of it. So this isn't some people thing. It's almost everyone falls into this loop at some point, regardless of how smart or motivated they actually are. And the difference between people who succeed and people who don't actually usually comes down to whether they recognize the pattern and have a plan for when it actually hits. So you can almost set a calendar reminder for when that breakdown will happen, give or take a few weeks depending on the goal, but the arc is nearly identical every time. And that predictability is actually good news, because predictable means preventable. And most people have cycled through this pattern actually dozens of times without even realizing it's the same loop. And they think each situation is unique. Each failure has its own special reason, when really the underlying dynamic is always the same. So the tricky part is that the pattern doesn't feel like a pattern when you're inside it. It feels like a series of reasonable decisions. You're not aware you're actually following a script. You just feel like you're responding to circumstances. And from inside the loop, you have the perfect justifications for every choice. Always. Quitting always feels rational. Pivoting always feels smart. The boredom itself gets rationalized away as something else entirely. And of course, we can talk about, there are moments, there is something to be said where pivoting is actually smart, where quitting is rational. But most of the time, 80% of the time, 90% of the time, this is not the case, right? It's only in hindsight that the pattern really becomes obvious. You look back and You realize you've done this exact thing 5 times before, but by then you're already on to the next shiny thing and the cycle continues. So the first phase is what I call the novelty phase. And this is where everything really feels amazing. You've just started something new, a project, a habit, a goal, and there's this genuine excitement that's coursing through your system. Dopamine is flowing, progress comes easy because even small steps actually feel meaningful here. You're motivated, you're focused, you're convinced this time it will be different. And everything about the new thing feels charged with possibility. You're learning, you're making decisions, you're building something from scratch. The feedback loop is also very tight because every action produces visible change, and that visibility is intoxicating. And also learning is very visible at that stage because it's something new. Your learning is very visible. You notice that you're learning new things and you're progressing. It's way more visible than later on. And progress in this phase is often legitimately fast because it's new. You're making moves, you're checking boxes, you're seeing results, which is great, but it also sets up unrealistic expectations for what sustained progress actually looks like later on. And to make another analogy with the gym, everybody knows that beginner gains are the best gains that you can get. It's just you progress a lot faster, you're gaining muscle a lot faster, and people often think that it's just going to continue like that or others just realistically know that it's not going to continue like that. However, thinking that it will continue like that forever is obviously misguided, and you're obviously setting yourself up for disappointment eventually because it won't continue like that. And it's the same here, right? Your brain is basically getting hit after hit of reward chemicals, new information, new accomplishments, new identity narratives. And it's like a honeymoon period for your nervous system, and it actually feels genuinely good. But there's a catch. This phase obviously lies to you. It makes you think that the whole journey will feel like this. And it doesn't prepare you for what's actually coming, which is a long stretch of flatness where the excitement disappears but the work doesn't, right? And the novelty phase always ends, always. At some point, you're no longer a beginner at that thing. There's no version of any goal where the excitement sustains indefinitely. The question isn't whether it will fade, it's what happens when it does. And that transition is where most people fall apart. Your brain literally can't maintain that level of dopamine response to the same stimulus. It's just how it works. Novelty, by definition, wears off. At some point, it's not novel anymore. The circuits that fired so eagerly at first start to habituate, and what felt thrilling becomes just normal. It just becomes another day. And this isn't a mindset problem that you can positive think your way out of. It's how the brain works. It's just how it is. Expecting the novelty phase to last forever is like expecting to stay awake indefinitely. Eventually, biology wins, right? And then comes the flat phase. And this is where the wheels start coming off for most people. The initial excitement has faded, progress has slowed down to a crawl, and the tasks that once felt meaningful now just feel repetitive and kind of pointless. You're doing the same things you were doing before, but now they just feel like a grind. And progress in this phase is often not as visible. It's often almost imperceptible. You're still moving forward, technically, but the changes are so small, at least in comparison to what you had in the beginning, that you can't really see them. And this is maddening for a brain that's used to quick feedback and visible progress. The gains are still happening. They're just below the threshold of perception. And it's like watching grass grow. The growth is real, but you can't see it day to day, which makes it feel like nothing is actually working. So your effort to reward ratio feels completely off. You're putting in the same energy, maybe even more, and getting way less back. And this imbalance can actually become pretty uncomfortable. And your brain starts looking for explanations. And often the explanation your brain lands on is that this isn't working, or that you picked the wrong approach. But that's usually wrong. The approach is fine. The thing is fine. You're just in the flat phase, which is a normal part of any worthwhile pursuit and of any learning arc, of any learning phase. So there's no external validation in this phase anymore, at least. And no one's really telling you you're doing great or noticing your progress. You're alone with the work, and the work has nothing to say back to you. And this phase tests your ability to self-motivate without any feedback or any external validation. Most people have never really trained that muscle. A lot of the people say they're starting something new before they've even actually started it. So a lot of people do things for that external validation. And when you get to a point where that doesn't exist anymore, well, it's way harder, right? So most people have never really trained it. And when they hit this stretch, they don't know how to keep going without someone or something actually cheering them on. And the flat phase exposes how dependent you really are on external validation. If you can only perform when there's an audience or people cheering you on or a reward at the end, this is where you find out. And for a lot of people, the answer is pretty uncomfortable. Now, the third phase is the escape phase. And this is the phase where most people quit without even admitting that they've quit. The boredom becomes unbearable. So your brain starts generating exit strategies that basically feel productive. You reach for your phone, you decide you need to do more research, you revisit the plan for the 15th time, and you start browsing new goals that seem more promising and new things that you can start. Now, the escape phase doesn't even look like quitting. It looks like you're pivoting or optimizing, and you'll tell yourself you're making a smart change when really you're just running from boredom. And that's it. The disguise is convincing enough that you believe your own story. So your brain is extremely good at constructing these narratives that justify escape. The strategy wasn't working anyway, or I found a better opportunity, or I need to step back and reassess. All of these can be true sometimes, but often they're just cover stories for boredom and tolerance. And this is also when you start hopping from one thing to the next, often called shiny object syndrome. A new opportunity catches your eye, a different strategy seems more promising, and suddenly you're convinced that the next thing will be better than the current thing. But it's not about the next thing being better, it's about the current thing being boring, or at least lacking that initial excitement you had. And so the transition into escape mode is very seamless. One day you're doing the work, the next day you're taking a break to think, and then somehow weeks pass and you've never returned to the thing. You've basically moved on to something else entirely, and it doesn't feel like a decision. It just feels like it happened out of nowhere. And then a few weeks later, you remember, oh yeah, that thing. And you remember that you just stopped. And then a few months later, the cycle starts again with a new project, novelty phase, flat phase, escape phase, over and over and over again, with a different goal each time, but the same pattern underneath. So escape can take a lot of forms. One of them can be obviously the obvious one, which is scrolling your phone, but there are sneakier ones too. Excessive planning, endless research, starting new projects before finishing old ones, anything that lets you avoid the boring work while still feeling productive is escape. So some of the most dangerous escapes actually look incredibly productive on the surface. Redesigning your routine, reorganizing your workspace, reading another book about the thing you should be doing. All of these can be ways of running from the actual work. Because these escape behaviors actually feel productive, they're also harder to catch. And you're not lying on the couch doing nothing. You're busy, you're engaged, you're active with something else. It's just that none of that activity is moving the needle on the thing that actually matters. And so the worst part is that most people quit in this flat phase, right before things would have started working. And everybody knows that meme of that guy that is basically digging for diamonds. The timing is almost cruel. You put in weeks or months of effort, you hit the boring stretch, you bail, and you never get to see what would have happened if you'd stayed a little longer. And there's often a lag between effort and results, especially in things like business, fitness, and creative work, like we talked about earlier. The payoff always comes later, after the hard or boring part. So when you quit during the flat phase, you're essentially walking away right before the return on investment would have arrived. So you're doing all that effort, and in the end, you're not sticking for a bit longer to at least get the results for all the effort you put. So you kind of become also addicted to just putting in the effort and not getting any results, almost. So this is especially true for anything also that compounds. Content, relationships, skills, investments. These things build momentum over time, and the early stages are always the slowest. So quitting early means you never get to the part where momentum starts working in your favor. And the worst part is you'll never know what you missed. You'll move on, you'll start something new, you'll hit the flat phase again, and never really realize that the thing you abandoned was weeks away from taking off. It's almost like planting some seeds and actually ripping them out before they even become plants. And this isn't a rare exception. It's the default for most people. Most goals die in the flat phase, killed not by the difficulty of the thing, but by the boredom of that initial excitement fading. And the graveyard of abandoned projects is really full of things that would have worked if people had just stayed a little longer. And if this happened to you, congratulations, you're normal. I mean, it's happened to me. This is why I'm making this whole training. But normal doesn't just mean optimal. Normal is losing. If you want different results, you need a different response to the flat phase. And the good news is this pattern is fixable once you see it clearly. You can learn to recognize when you're in the flat phase and respond differently than you have in the past. And that's literally what the rest of this training is about. So let's talk about why this pattern has actually gotten worse in the recent years, because there's a reason boredom feels more unbearable than it used to back in the day. And that is mostly, unfortunately, technology. As good as it can be, it can also hijack our attention, and your phone, and specifically the apps on it, basically trains your nervous system to expect constant novelty and micro rewards, right? Every few seconds, something new. Every swipe, a tiny hit of dopamine, and your baseline has been completely warped. And this is basic conditioning. You've been exposed to thousands of hours of variable reward stimulation, which is the most addictive pattern there is. So your brain has basically adapted to that environment, to that variable reward stimulation. And now anything that doesn't match that stimulation level feels wrong. It feels boring. And this is happening at a physical level in your brain. The circuits that actually respond to reward have been recalibrated around the assumption of constant input, of constant stimulation, of constant rewards. And when that input disappears, like when you're doing boring work, your brain experiences something close to basically withdrawal. And you're not consciously choosing to be addicted to that stimulation. It just happened gradually in the background over years because you're using technology, because we're all using it. So it just happens to us. And by the time you notice something's off, the conditioning is already deep. And it's not just your phone, it's Netflix, it's YouTube, it's the entire internet ecosystem that's literally optimized to capture and hold your attention through novelty. This is the gold mine for all of social media, all of the internet. If they can capture your attention and hold it for long enough, maybe you'll see enough ads to buy something. So every piece of it is basically training you to expect more stimulation than real work can provide. And the result is that your dopamine baseline is, for lack of a better word, fried, right? Not permanently, obviously, but significantly dysregulated. And things that would have felt engaging 10 years ago just now feel intolerably dull because your threshold for stimulation has just shifted upwards. So boredom is relative to your baseline. If your baseline is set to constant novelty and constant stimulation, then anything less than that registers as boring. And a task that requires sustained focus with no variable rewards feels like torture because it's so far below your calibrated normal. It's definitely not as quote-unquote rewarding as watching short-form content or reels on Instagram. So this tends to escalate over time unless you deliberately intervene, unless you bring some awareness into that. The more stimulation you consume, the higher your baseline goes, and the more intolerable boredom becomes. So it's a feedback loop that doesn't self-correct. And this is why boring work literally feels painful to a lot of people. When your nervous system is expecting stimulation and not getting it, the experience registers as kind of deprivation. Silence and monotony feel like something's wrong, even when nothing is really wrong. And the feeling is similar to mild withdrawal, restlessness, irritability, an urgent need to reach for something, anything that basically provides stimulation. And your body is having a physiological response to the absence of input, that it's been conditioned to expect. And this isn't all in your head. You might notice actual physical discomfort, fidgeting, tightness, an inability to sit still. Your body is signaling that something needs to change, even though logically you know you're fine. And this is also the reason why so many people have a hard time actually reading books and just paying attention to what they're reading. The urge to escape always feels urgent, like you need to check your phone right now. And it's not a real emergency, but it sure feels like one. And the pull toward that stimulation is convincing. Your brain will generate all kinds of justifications for why you need to take a break or check something or switch tasks. It almost feels like pain. So most people misinterpret this discomfort as evidence that the task is wrong for them, or that they need a different approach, or that something else is off, and they don't recognize it as simple stimulation withdrawal. So they follow the discomfort out of the task instead of sitting with it. And that misdiagnosis leads to wrong solutions. You think you need a new system or more motivation or a clearer purpose, when really you just need to let your nervous system adjust to lower stimulation levels. That's all. All that energy spent looking for external fixes could be better spent simply building tolerance. But because the problem is misunderstood, the effort goes in the wrong direction over and over and over again. So if stimulation addiction is the real issue, then the real solution is recalibration. You basically have to undo some of the conditioning. You have to teach your brain that low stimulation environments are comfortable. And this doesn't only come down to a mindset shift, but also a physiological adaptation. Your nervous system can change. Neuroplasticity works in both directions, right? Just like it adapted to constant stimulation, it can readapt to periods of monotony. But this requires deliberate exposure, not just hoping things will get better on their own. And yeah, that deliberate exposure might feel a bit uncomfortable, but you got here. So if you want to fix it, this is how you do it. Now, recalibration is an active process. You have to put yourself in so-called boring situations intentionally and stay there long enough for your system to adjust. So the adaptation happens gradually. You probably won't notice big shifts day to day, but over weeks and months, your tolerance will expand. At the end of the day, it will happen faster than you think it will if you just keep at it. So things that felt unbearable start to feel manageable, and then neutral, and then almost easy. And if you go back to heavy stimulation consumption, the gains reverse. And so this isn't a one-time fix. It's a capacity you have to maintain through ongoing practice, which is fine because the practice itself is very simple. The training has to be intentional. You can't just accidentally become more boredom tolerant by living your normal life, because your normal life is probably saturated with stimulation. So you have to carve out spaces specifically for low stimulation work. Now, some structure helps here. Having specific times or tasks designated for boredom and for boredom training makes it easier to follow through than just vaguely planning to be more focused. So the next section will give you that structure. Now that you understand why monotony breaks most people and what's actually happening in your nervous system when you hit the flat phase, we can get into the practical framework for actually building that tolerance. And that's where things get actionable. So at this point, you should have a clear picture of the enemy. You know the failure loop. You know what phase kills most goals. And you know that stimulation addiction has raised your boredom threshold artificially high. And you know that the solution is recalibration. So naming the problem is half the battle, right? That's what people say. Most people never get this far, and they stay stuck in the loop because they don't understand what's actually happening to them. Now you're already ahead, but just by having this framework. So from now on, when you feel the urge to escape boring work, you recognize it for what it is, which is a conditioned response, a signal from a nervous system calibrated for constant novelty and stimulation. And because you're aware, you can now choose differently. Awareness creates a gap between stimulus and response. And in that gap, you basically have a chance to stay instead of run away. Now, the next section breaks down exactly how to train boredom tolerance systematically in a way that works with your nervous system instead of against it. No willpower required, just small, progressive exposure, progressive overload, essentially. Everything from here forward is about building the capacity we've been discussing. So the mechanics are surprisingly simple, which doesn't mean they're easy, but it does mean that they're doable. So with that said, let's talk about training boredom tolerance. All right, so training boredom tolerance works the same way training anything else works. Progressive exposure. You start with small, manageable doses of boredom and you let your nervous system adapt, and then you gradually increase the difficulty. So trying to jump straight into marathon focus sessions when you can barely handle 10 minutes is obviously a recipe for failure. You have to meet your brain where it is and build from there. The same way as in a video game. If you're level 0 or level 1, you're not going to go against a player that's level 100, right? You're going to build up to that point. So the key word is gradual. You're not trying to force your way through hours of boring work on day one. That approach will obviously backfire because it reinforces the idea that boredom is unbearable and requires extreme effort to tolerate. So again, back to the video game example. If you went and played a video game and you're level 1 and you could only play against level 100 players, well, the game won't be that exciting to play, right? Because they're going to just keep beating you, essentially. So instead, you want to make the exposure easy enough that your system can actually adapt over time. So sustainable beats intense here. Your nervous system needs consistent, repeated signals to change, and consistency requires a difficulty level that you can actually stick with. So each time you complete a boredom exposure without escaping, you're sending a signal to your brain that this is survivable. And that signal accumulates over time. The adaptation happens quietly in the background, and one day you notice that things that used to feel unbearable now feel fine, right? Like most worthwhile skills, boredom tolerance compounds. So small daily investments will add up to significant capacity over weeks and months. And you just have to have the patience for that. The people who seem to have superhuman focus didn't really start that way. They build it incrementally, often without even realizing that that's what they were actually doing. So I'm going to give you a 3-level framework for this. And you can think of it like a ladder. You start at the bottom with micro exposures. and you work your way up to full work blocks and eventually graduate to sustained repetition without any novelty. So each level will build on the previous one, so don't try to skip ahead. The levels are sequential for a reason. Level 1 rewires your baseline response to boredom, level 2 applies that to actual work, and level 3 extends it across time. So trying to do level 3 when you really haven't built the foundation from levels 1 to 2 is like trying to run a marathon before you can actually jog a mile. So having clear levels gives you a roadmap. You'll know where you are, what you're working on, and when you're ready to progress. And this will just remove a lot of the ambiguity that causes people to either push too hard or not push hard enough, right? So level 1 is micro boredom, and this is the entry point. It's designed to be almost stupidly easy. You're going to do one boring task for 10 to 15 minutes with zero stimulation, no music, no podcast, no phone in the room, no nothing other than you and the work. Just you and the task, that's it. So the tasks at this level should be things you'd normally do anyway, just without the usual stimulation that's layered on top. So walking without earbuds, cleaning without background TV or music, reading without checking your phone every few pages, sitting and drinking your coffee without scrolling. The task itself doesn't matter much. What matters is the absence of that stimulation. So some good options for this are folding laundry and silence. Very boring, I know, but try it out. Washing dishes without a podcast, eating a meal without screens, walking around the block without any headphones, reading a physical book with your phone in another room. Just pick whatever fits naturally into your day. Now, the stakes at this level are intentionally very low. You're not obviously trying to accomplish anything impressive here. You're just teaching your brain that boredom exists and that it's not dangerous and that you can actually sit with it without the world ending. That's the whole lesson. Consistency here matters way more than duration. So if you do this daily over time, it will improve. 10 minutes every day beats an hour once a week. So you're building a new default response, and defaults require repetition to install. Now, the purpose of level 1 is recalibration, like we talked about earlier. You're resetting your baseline and your baseline expectation for stimulation. Right now, your brain probably expects constant input, and anything less than that basically triggers escape behaviors. Microboredom teaches your brain to tolerate and eventually even relax into lower stimulation environments. And this is foundational work. It might feel too easy to matter, but if you skip it, you won't get to level 2. And so don't skip it. The people who struggle with focus usually have nervous systems that freak out the moment stimulation drops. So level 1 directly addresses that root issue. The good news is this level moves pretty quickly. Most people start noticing a change within a week or two. The silence that basically felt uncomfortable at first will start to feel now natural, maybe even pleasant. And that's the signal you're ready to move up. So in this phase, you'll also start noticing more ideas coming up, decisions you've been avoiding, open loops that need to be closed because you're only left with your thoughts, and that's the point. So think of level 1 as the gateway. It opens up the possibility of deeper work by proving to your nervous system that boredom won't kill you. And once that's established, everything else becomes easier. Now, level 2 is single task work blocks. And this is where you start applying boredom tolerance to actual work that matters. So you pick one task, you set a timer for 30 to 60 minutes, and you do that task without switching to anything else. No just checking, no email, no quick phone glances, one task the whole time. Now the key here is singular focus. Your brain will want to multitask. It will also want to check something quickly. It will also want to quickly handle something else. Every one of these impulses is an escape attempt. Your job is to notice the impulse and basically stay away. And the task will stay singular even when your brain is screaming for variety. And look, you will feel urges to switch, and that's normal, and it's actually the point. Each urge is a training opportunity. When you feel the pull to check your phone or open a new tab and you don't actually act on it, you're basically strengthening the circuit that allows for sustained attention. Now, here's a useful rule as well. If you feel the urge to switch tasks during your block, you have two options. Option 1, stay on the task. Option 2, sit there and do nothing until the urge passes. What you don't get to do is actually switch to something stimulating. That just breaks the cycle. So this rule retrains impulse control surprisingly fast, and the do nothing option sounds weird, but it also works. If you can't stay on task, just sit there. Just literally sit and do absolutely nothing. Stare at the wall if you have to. Or just wait. Eventually your brain will get bored of being bored, essentially, and it will get back to the task because at least that's something. It's a hack that basically uses boredom against itself. Now, the timer is also important. So having a defined endpoint makes the discomfort more tolerable because you know it's temporary. So, like Elizabeth Wurtzel says in one of her books, a human being can survive almost anything as long as she sees the end in sight. Or, as Viktor Frankl said, pain is only bearable if we know it will end. So, obviously, you're not committing to focus forever, just for the next 30 or 60 minutes. And that psychological containment actually matters, especially early on. So, when the timer goes off, you can stop, even if you're in flow. Even if you want to keep going, stop. It's actually better if you do stop, because you're basically also learning to trust yourself that you're going to stop when you say you will. Otherwise, you won't want to do this again. So this teaches your brain to trust the timer, which makes it easier to start the next session and to trust yourself to actually stop. And you're building reliability into the practice itself. So start with whatever duration you can actually complete. Even if 30 minutes feels impossible, start with 20. If 60 feels easy, then push it to 90. The specific numbers matters less than the principle of the single tasking, right? And as your tolerance builds, you can actually extend the duration, of course. Most people find that they can add 10 to 15 minutes every week or two without much strain. So let your capacity grow organically rather than forcing it. Now, level 3 is repetition without novelty. And this is the advanced level. It's where winners separate from everyone else. You're going to do the same task at the same time, following the same process day after day. No variation for the sake of variation, no mixing it up to stay interested. Just the same thing at the same time in the same way over and over and over again. Same task, same slot, same approach. You're deliberately removing novelty from the equation because novelty is a crutch your brain uses to avoid real boredom tolerance. So when you can do something repetitive for weeks without needing to change it up, you've reached a level of tolerance that most people never actually achieve. And what this looks like in practice is writing every morning at 7 a.m., using the same routine regardless of how you feel, making sales calls at the same time each day, regardless of results, going to the gym at the same hour, doing the same workout split, regardless of motivation. The sameness is the point. And this will feel boring. That's the whole idea. You're training your capacity to execute without novelty, without excitement, without the emotional payoff of something new. If it feels repetitive, then you're doing it right. And in fact, boredom at this level is a signal of mastery. You're training your capacity to execute without novelty, without excitement, right? So it means you've stripped away all the easy dopamine sources and you're still showing up. That's rare, and it's exactly the capacity that separates people who get consistent results from people who don't. Now, level 3 is also about sustained execution over time. Anyone can do something once. Lots of people can do it for a week when motivation is high. Very few can actually do the same thing the same way for months or years without needing novelty to keep them going. So this is a long game. You're building the capacity to execute on timelines that most people can't even tolerate. The entrepreneur who grinds for 3 years before seeing results, for example. The content creator who posts for 18 months before even getting traction. These people have level 3 boredom tolerance, even if they don't call it that. Everything valuable compounds, and compounding requires time, and time requires sustained effort without novelty. Level 3 boredom tolerance is essentially the capacity to let things compound. It's the skill underneath the skill. If you can operate at this level consistently, you're in the top few percent of executors, of action takers. Most of your competition will quit in the flat phase while you keep going. And that's the point. That's not because you're more talented or more motivated. That's the best part about this. It's because you've built a capacity that they haven't. It's because you've trained. As Anders Ericsson notes in Peak, the difference between expert performers and normal adults reflects a lifelong period of deliberate effort to improve performance in a specific domain. The capacity to sustain that repetitive effort without novelty is exactly what separates those who reach mastery from those who stop early. So now, there's also a rule that makes all of this work, and it's non-negotiable. The boring work has to stay boring. No dopamine stacking, right? No layering stimulation on top of monotonous tasks to get through them. When you add music to make writing easier, or podcasts to make exercise bearable, or snacks to reward yourself for focusing, you're avoiding boredom instead of training tolerance. The exposure has to be pure. Your brain only will adapt to what it's actually exposed to, right? If you always add stimulation to boring tasks, then your brain never really learns to tolerate boring tasks alone. It learns to tolerate boring tasks with stimulation on top. So you're just teaching it that boredom requires compensation, which is the opposite of what we want. Every time you add stimulation to a boring task, you're undermining the training effect. You feel like you're being smart, making the work more pleasant, but you're actually preventing the adaptation that would make stimulation unnecessary in the first place. So you're also creating dependency. If you always listen to music while doing deep work, you'll eventually need music to do deep work. The crutch becomes a requirement, and now you've basically added a constraint instead of building capacity by doing that. So it feels counterproductive to make things harder than they need to be, but that's exactly the logic of training, right? You don't build strength by lifting the lightest weights available. You build boredom tolerance by actually experiencing boredom, not by engineering it away. So this is the hardest part for most people. We're so used to optimizing for comfort that deliberately sitting with discomfort feels wrong. But the discomfort is the stimulus. Removing it removes the training effect. There's no shortcut here. The good news is that this discomfort is temporary. As your tolerance basically increases, the tasks that required stimulation to get through will start feeling manageable on their own and maybe even enjoyable. You won't need the music or the podcast forever. Your brain adapts and the need basically fades. And then you have real freedom. You can work anywhere, anytime without needing optimal conditions. You're not dependent on playlists or environments or rituals to get into focus mode. You just do the work. That independence is worth the initial discomfort. And this capacity is earned, it's not given. Everyone who has it paid the same price, sitting with boredom long enough for their nervous system to adapt. There's no hack, no workaround, no technique that lets you skip the exposure. The exposure is the technique. So setting up your environment makes all of this easier as well. You want to remove temptation before it becomes an issue. So put your phone on airplane mode or turned off in another room, not just face down next to you. Or use browser extensions that block distracting sites. Notifications need to be fully off, not silenced. The goal is to make escape inconvenient enough that staying with the task is the path of least resistance. So try to add as much friction to escape behaviors as possible. Every obstacle between you and the distraction buys you a few seconds of a pause. And those seconds are often enough to catch the impulse and choose differently, right? So the easier you make it to escape, the more you'll escape. Physical distance from your phone is surprisingly effective. If it's in another room, you have to basically get up to check it. And that small barrier is often enough to interrupt the automatic reach. And if it's off completely in another room, then not only do you have to get up and go check it, but you'll have to turn it on, enter your PIN code, etc. Most phone checks aren't even conscious decisions, they're reflexes, and reflexes can be disrupted by physical obstacles. Same principle applies digitally. So use website blockers during your work blocks. Turn off all the notifications you have entirely, not just for some apps. Log out of social media so you have to actively log back in to check it. Every friction point helps, and the environment should be intentionally sparse. Nothing in your field of vision that could pull your attention should be there. No extra tabs open, no just-in-case items on your desk, right? You're creating conditions where focused attention is the default, not the exception. So your environment can either support your training or sabotage it. Most people's environments are optimized for stimulation and distraction. You want the opposite, an environment optimized for boredom tolerance, where the easiest thing to do is to actually stay on task. And this isn't about willpower, it's about design. If you have to rely on willpower to resist distraction, you've already lost. Willpower depletes, especially over the course of a day. Good environmental design doesn't. So stack the deck in your favor before the session even starts, before the day even begins. And keep your environment consistently configured for focus. So don't set it up fresh each time. The more automatic and routine your environment is, the less decision-making energy you spend before you even start working. Now, the hardest part is usually starting. Once you're 5 minutes into a task, momentum takes over and continuing feels easier. But those first few minutes where you're transitioning from high stimulation to low stimulation can actually feel almost painful. And what helps here is to just expect it and to push through it anyway, right? The transition period is where most people bail. Your brain is still expecting stimulation and it hasn't yet adjusted to the task, and the discomfort peaks. So if you can survive the first few minutes, the rest usually takes care of itself. Now, expecting this and knowing it in advance is what helps here. So when the discomfort hits in minute 2 or 3, you can recognize it as the transition, not as evidence that something is wrong. It's predictable, it's temporary, and it always passes. So a useful rule for this is to never quit in the first 5 minutes. No matter how bad it feels, just stick it out for 5 minutes. And if you still want to quit after that, fine. But usually the urge fades once you've pushed through the transition. Now, after the transition, momentum kicks in. The task starts to basically hold your attention on its own. and the need for stimulation quiets down. Now, getting to this point is the whole battle, right? This is what we're going for. Once you're there, staying is relatively easy. Also, try to start faster than you think you should. Don't wait until you feel ready or motivated. Just start. Feelings follow actions, not the other way around. So the longer you wait for the right state, the more resistance builds. When it's time to work, just start immediately. No ritual, no preparation, no warming up. Open the document and just start typing. Pick up the phone and start dialing. Beginning quickly cuts off the negotiation phase where your brain tries to talk you out of it. So let the start be a bit ugly. The first few minutes don't even have to be good. They just have to exist. You can fix and refine things later, but what's important here is to just start. Getting something going, anything, is better than stalling out while waiting for conditions to be perfect. And it helps to track your boredom tolerance practice as well, at least in the early stages. I'm not talking about anything fancy here. I'm talking about a simple log of what you did and for how long. And it can be just on your Apple Notes or Samsung Notes, depending on what you use. This creates visibility and accountability. So you'll start to notice patterns, you'll start to see progress, and you'll also build identity around being someone who does this kind of training. Now, making your practice visible also matters. So it can be a streak on your calendar or a check mark in your notebook or some kind of a tally on a whiteboard or on your phone, something that lets you see consistency accumulating over time, because visual evidence of progress reinforces the behavior and it makes it harder to skip. So seeing a row of completed sessions is motivating in itself. If you pick up your phone and you just see how many focus sessions you've done successfully, that by itself is pretty motivating. You don't want to break the streak. So the longer the streak, the more invested you become. And it's a simple psychological lever that does work even when motivation is low. Tracking also helps keep you honest to yourself. So if you're supposed to do a 30-minute block and you only did 15, you actually have to record that. You can't lie to yourself. The record reflects reality, not intention. That honesty will prevent that slow drift where you gradually water down the practice without even noticing. So make one promise to yourself, and that is to be honest with what you did. So over time, that tracking will reveal patterns. You might notice certain days are actually harder. Certain times maybe work better. Certain tasks are more challenging. That data helps you refine the practice to fit your actual life, not some idealized version. So keep the tracking system simple. If it takes more than a few seconds to actually log, you'll stop doing it. So a single line per day is enough. The date, the task, the duration of focus, done. That's it. Don't turn tracking into another project that requires motivation to maintain. The tracking should require minimal friction. A notes app, a paper list, a simple spreadsheet, anything more elaborate is probably overkill and will become a barrier instead of support. So keep in mind, you might not need to track forever. Once the habit is actually established and the capacity is built, you can drop the tracking. It's still helpful, but it's also scaffolding, useful while you're building, but you can remove it once the structure can stand on its own. Now, how do you know that the training is actually working? There are some clear markers to watch for. And you, for example, notice that the internal debate about whether to start on a task will start getting shorter and quieter, and you will just basically start without the whole preceding resistance kind of thing. Other signs are you'll feel less urgency to escape once you're in a task. So the time starts to feel different. It starts to feel more stretched and more spacious instead of compressed and frantic and urgent all the time. The background anxiety of I should be doing something else itself will fade. And these are all indicators that your nervous system is adapting. So there's a calm that develops. You're not forcing anymore. The task is just a task and you're doing it. That neutral ease is the goal. Boredom tolerance at its best just feels like space. It feels like peace, not struggle, right? You'll start faster because the resistance that used to eat up 20 minutes of procrastination before each work session shrinks to about a minute or two and then to almost nothing. So the gap between I should work and I am working actually collapses, and discipline itself will start to feel easier. So when all of that resistance drops, you don't need as much willpower to push through. The same actions that used to feel heavy now start to feel almost effortless. And that's the adaptation showing up. Now, these shifts are gradual. You probably won't notice them day to day, but if you compare yourself now to yourself 3 months from now, the difference will be humongous. It will be obvious. So keep practicing even when progress feels invisible, because the changes are happening beneath the surface. And in the beginning, they won't be very visible, but over time, you'll notice. And if you track, you'll see it, right? Every session adds to the cumulative effect, even the hard ones, even the ones where you almost quit, even the ones that felt like nothing really happened. Just trust the process because the adaptation is occurring whether you feel it or not. And at this point, you have the full framework. You understand the ladder, the no stimulation rule, the environment setup, the starting principles, and the markers of progress. So now the final piece is really understanding how all of this turns into actual success outcomes. And that's what we'll cover in the next section. So let's talk about making boredom work for you. So boredom tolerance is basically a multiplier on everything else you do. Your work, your skills, your offers, all of it works better when you can actually stay in execution long enough for things to actually compound. So the people who build real wealth, health, and success aren't doing anything crazy. They're just doing obvious things longer than everyone else. And time is the multiplier that most people can't access because they can't tolerate the boredom required to let time work. Compounding needs time. Time needs sustained effort. Sustained effort needs boredom tolerance, right? That's the chain. And now you have all the links. So the magic of compounding is invisible in the early stages, which is why most people quit. The first year of almost anything looks pretty unimpressive, but year 2 builds on year 1 and year 3 builds on year 2, and eventually the curve goes exponential beyond year 5. So you just have to survive the flat part. Boredom tolerance is really just operational patience. The ability to keep doing the thing while trusting that the results are forming somewhere you can't see yet. And that kind of patience used to be common. Now it's a superpower. So every skill you have gets multiplied by how long you can apply it. A mediocre writer who writes every day for 5 years will outperform a talented writer who burns out after 6 months. The talent can matter, sure, if you believe in talent, but tolerance for repetition matters more over long enough timelines. Now, durability beats intensity almost every time. The person who can show up at 70% of effort for years beats the person who shows up at 100% effort for weeks. Boredom tolerance is what makes durability possible. So small actions accumulate into massive results, but only if you keep doing them. One email doesn't build a business, right? We all know that. One workout doesn't build a body. One healthy meal doesn't help you lose fat. But 1,000 of each, repeated boringly over years, that builds empires, right? Now, what you're really building is dangerous consistency, the kind of consistency that looks boring from the outside, but produces results that seem almost unfair. And people will wonder what your secret is, and the secret is just that you kept going while they kept starting over. In the book Grit, for example, Angela Duckworth says, "Enthusiasm is common, endurance is rare." And that endurance, that willingness to keep showing up when others have moved on, is really what separates outcomes. Now, there's nothing flashy about this, just the same work done the same way, over and over until the results become undeniable. Now, most people are looking for excitement. You, on the other hand, are looking for good, old, boring, monotonous repetition. The path is genuinely unsexy. The same morning routine, same work blocks, same follow-up sequences, same content schedule. The sameness is the feature, is the point. It's what allows momentum to build instead of constantly resetting to zero. And you become reliable to yourself and to others, and people will start trusting you more because people trust consistent performers because consistent performers deliver, right? Your reputation compounds with your results. And this is what separates the people who make it from the people who almost make it, right? Both groups have goals, both groups have ideas, both groups work hard at least sometimes. The difference is one group can tolerate the boring middle and the others can't. So your edge isn't being smarter or luckier. Your edge is really being able to outlast. In any competitive field, the people still standing after a few years have usually won by default because everyone else got bored and left. For example, in The Slight Edge, which is one of my favorite books, Jeff Olson says the things that are easy to do are also easy not to do. So most people choose the easy path of quitting when boredom sets in, which is exactly why persistence becomes such a powerful competitive advantage. Success often comes to whoever is still in the game when opportunities finally show up. Boredom tolerance keeps you in the game. That's its function, literally. Everything else is downstream from that. So over time, this will stop being something you do and starts being something you are. You become a person who shows up regardless of how it feels. And that change in your identity is powerful because it removes the daily negotiation we talked about earlier, the inner debates. You don't debate whether to do the work anymore, you just do it because that's who you are now. And the behavior becomes automatic, like brushing your teeth or locking your door. There's no resistance because there's no decision. The question of should I do this today simply doesn't arise. You do it because you're someone who does it. And that's it. What used to require willpower starts to feel effortless. The same actions that once drained you now cost almost nothing. And that's the adaptation fully expressed. Your nervous system has basically reorganized now around this new pattern. So your output becomes stable and predictable. Bad days don't derail you because the behavior isn't tied to how you feel. You've decoupled action from emotion, which is one of the most valuable things you can do for long-term success. So the identity reinforces itself. Each completed session also strengthens the story that you're someone with high boredom tolerance. And that story makes the next session earlier. It's a positive feedback loop that gets stronger over time. You start to see yourself differently, and the narrative basically shifts from I'm trying to build discipline to I'm a disciplined person. And that's a subtle but massive change. Trying is exhausting. Being is natural. And once the identity locks in, the capacity feels permanent. It's yours now, built through thousands of small exposures. Nobody can take it away from you, and it travels with you into every project, goal, or phase of life. So let me give you the simplest possible daily protocol that you can start tomorrow. Choose one boring task that actually matters to you, remove all stimulation, set a 30-minute timer, and do the task or sit there doing absolutely nothing. And just repeat that daily. That's the whole thing. Now, don't wait for the perfect moment or the perfect mood. Start tomorrow morning, pick the task tonight so that there's no decision you have to make when you wake up. Just pick it tonight and start tomorrow morning. And this is that same remove the negotiation principle we covered in the environment section. First thing, before your brain has a chance to start the debate, start the timer and go. And the sooner you start, the sooner the adaptation begins. Every day you delay is a day the old patterns stay locked in and they reinforce, and so become stronger. There's no benefit to waiting, only cost. So start smaller than you think you need to. 15 minutes is fine. 20 is fine. The goal for the first week is just to establish the habit, not to push your limits. Limits can expand later. Now, daily practice is non-negotiable. So the signal to your nervous system has to be consistent. So that's why it's important to start with something manageable at first. If you're going to be doing it daily, then start with something you can actually do. Sporadic practice produces sporadic results. So you're trying to build a new baseline here, and baselines require repetition and some time as well. So make it a priority, not an afterthought. Schedule it like an important meeting, protect the time, and if you treat it as optional, you'll just skip it when things get busy, and things will always get busy. So remember that each session adds to the cumulative effect. Even the sessions that feel pointless are doing work beneath the surface. Trust the process and just keep showing up. That's it. Now here's the truth underneath everything we've covered. Most people don't lose because they're weak or untalented. They lose because they get bored and quit. That's all. The competition in anything you do isn't really as fierce as it looks because most of it self-eliminates through boredom intolerance. So if you can outlast the boredom like we talked about with the operational patience earlier, you don't need exceptional talent. Time does the rest. It's almost disappointingly simple. Stay engaged with the boring work longer than everyone else and you'll outperform people with more resources, more connections, and more natural ability. Boredom tolerance is the great equalizer. This is accessible to anyone. You don't need money, you don't need credentials, or any lucky breaks. You just need to build the capacity to sit with monotony for a long period of time. And that's within reach for literally everyone reading this or watching this. So, and on the other hand, it's also immediately actionable. You can start today, right now actually. You can pick a task, remove the stimulation, start the timer, and that's it. The path from here to results is a straight line of repetition. So that's it. Boredom tolerance is a cheat code, not in the way like it's a hack or some kind of a shortcut, but rather because it's the one capacity that makes everything else actually work. Build it, maintain it, and let time do what time does. The results will come, but you have to give time its time, essentially. So this capacity is yours to build. Nobody can really do it for you, and nobody can really stop you from developing it. It's entirely within your control, which is rare and valuable in a world full of things that are outside of your control. Now, the only question that is left is whether you'll actually do the work, because you have the framework, you understand the why, you know the how. So now it's just about executing on it, one boring session at a time. That's it. Now, let's go over the review. We talked about boredom as the real bottleneck. We talked about why monotony breaks most people. We talked about training boredom tolerance, making boredom work for you, the review, and finally, your action items for the day and the next few days. So tomorrow morning, pick one boring task that matters, remove all stimulation, set a 30-minute timer, and either do the task or sit there doing nothing until the timer ends. And then practice micro boredom daily for 1 to 2 weeks, then graduate to single task work blocks. Then progress to repetition without novelty as your tolerance expands. And then finally, design your environment to remove escape routes before each session. Track your practice to maintain consistency and trust the process even when progress feels invisible. With that said, if you enjoyed this video and you like content like this, then make sure to hit the subscribe button, give the video a like, comment below what you'd like to see next. And if you're an entrepreneur, creator, or professional and you'd like to work with me one-on-one, then make sure you book a call from the link in the description. And if you want this document along with this training, then make sure to join the free community from the link below. With that being said, thank you for being here, and I'm going to see you in the next one.